everybody. I'm Candid Frank Stanisci of Candid Frank Live's Leaf Talk. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate your watching and hope you can enjoy our views. Maybe scratch an itch that you have as far as thoughts are concerned. And today we have a very special guest. Aaron's busy, so we went to the next best thing. David Morisuti. David, thanks for being here.
So glad to get called up from the minors, Frank. Thank you for that.
You mean called down from the majors. So I want to welcome everybody to the Spanglish World Network on Zingo TV, channel 250. Please remember to download the Zingo TV app at the respective app stores for iOS and Android devices. While you download, make sure you rate and leave a comment. Both apps are absolutely free. Zingo TV is available on Google Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Fire TV sticks, Roku sticks, and also on all smart TVs 2016 forward. Well, here we go. This is playoff hockey at its very best and its least predictability. I guess if there was one comment that you had to make, David, about these playoffs and these specific series between the Tampa Bay Lightning and the Toronto Maple Leafs, that since the first two games have been played in Toronto and before the next two games, starting with tonight, being played in Tampa, what would that be?
It's really hard to gauge the series when you have two blowout wins when each team has a blowout, because that's the issue. Is people are saying, oh, who's the better team? We really can't say for certain because they've been both games have been played on lopsided edges here, and that we're trying to now find. This is where kind of the third game should give one team a more of a clear-cut idea of who exactly has the advantage. So that's really what I've figured so far, is that the games have been so lopsided. It's really hard to gauge where these both teams stand right now.
Yeah, and to your point, it is no longer a 7-game series. It's now a 5-game series. And in a 5-game series, you only have to win 3, not 4.
Yeah.
So, to your point, the victory tonight does not guarantee a victor in the series at all, but it gives them a bit of a toehold. Unfortunately, if looking at history, the Leafs have stubbed their toe. They've been in the position where they've been able to play that last game to eliminate the opposition, and they have failed to do so. So, historically, David, we know they can get there to that point, where they can get to the point where, they haven't struggled to get to, we just got to win this last game.
Yeah, I mean, the last two times they've been in the playoffs, they had the team that they were playing, their opponents on the ropes, right? Last year,
Absolutely.
they could have won the series in 6. They didn't, and they lost the series in 7. Montreal, you have the 3-1 series lead, could have ended it in game 5. They couldn't do it and then Montreal comes back and win it. This is where the Leafs have to, good teams figure out a way that when the situation is tough, they find a way to pick up the win. And for the Leafs, that's going to be the case when they go to Tampa. Tampa knows now they technically have the advantage right now because they split the first 2 games at home against Toronto. On the road, they split the 2 games on the road. So now the Leafs, what the Leafs need to do is like, okay, we do not want this series going back to Tampa Bay for Game 6. That should be the Leafs mentality, really. A split is obviously the next best case scenario for the Leafs, but if the Leafs want to truly show that this year is different, they leave Tampa Bay with the series lead and a chance to clinch it at home.
To your point, they need to win tonight. That's if anything of what you're saying is to work out or exist, it has to mean that they need to win tonight to put Tampa on desperation mode. Their goalie, a great goalie who has, at least not until last year, I think, in the playoffs after they played the Leafs, have never lost 2 games in a row. He has not lost 2 games in a row in the playoffs against the Maple Leafs. This is something the Leafs need to get that. If to win that one today is one thing that, one boogaboo that they can set aside, right? And if there's nothing to be said about the Leafs more than anything, it has to be that they are fighting boogaboos. They're fighting the idea that, Marner and company and Matthews have not played well in the playoffs. But what we saw in the last game, if we can talk about the last game, what we saw is we saw the big names right down to to Morgan Riley. We've had lots of conversations on your show, in private, on the phone, talking about how Riley has not been the defenseman that the Leafs need him to be. In the last game, he was everything the Leafs need him to be.
Yeah, no, exactly. If we know that if the Leafs are going to do anything in the playoffs, best players have to be their best players, and we tend to forget that Morgan Riley, given everything that has been said about him this season, everything that his play this season, it remains true that he is their most important defenseman. And when he is playing at his best, the Leafs are at their best. But like that, there's no clearer way of saying that because you know they paid him as though he is their most important defenseman, right? There are things that Morgan Riley can do on the blue line that no other player on the Leafs can do.
Or you expect to do, or you expect
Exactly.
to do.
Exactly.
They can still we can still see those players do magical things for the back end of the Maple Leafs. But we know that the Leafs rely, by virtue of what you said, and it's not about the paycheck. What it's about the player. And this player, Morgan Riley, has had a so-so, maybe less than so-so year. And the beauty of the playoffs, folks, and we all know this, come on, anybody who's watched hockey, who's watched any sport, playoffs are the opportunity for redemption. You can really redempt your previous play in the regular season in a short window, change people's perspective on your abilities and your talent and how good you are and important you are to a team. Morgan Riley did that in the last game. The Leafs get more of that, especially when we look at the situation where Tampa's best defenseman isn't even on the ice or the bench.
Yeah, no, that's the big one there. You know, with Hedman not playing, and it's not just Hedman. Chernak is out too, who's
Absolutely.
another top four defenseman. It puts Mikhail Sergachev as their top defenseman, which for a lot of teams, that's a really good defenseman. But the
Mhm.
problem is Tampa doesn't have the depth behind those guys to really step up. Like,
Or ahead. Or ahead.
yeah,
Because that's your point. Your point is it's a domino effect, right? You remove the two best defensemen. Now, is the third defenseman able to fill those shoes?
and he's not.
Likely not. Yeah, agreed.
And I said that when the Predators decided to get rid of Ryan McDonough because they had cap issues and they couldn't afford to keep. Well, he was they could afford to keep him. If they decided not to, make other moves. And when they made that decision, they decided that they were going to hold on to the hope that Hedman, Chernak, and Sergachev are going to be enough. Doesn't matter who they play with, they would have those three guys being able to rely on them and to carry this team. But what they fail to understand, and a lot of teams certainly do, one or two injuries really force you in a very bad situation where you put guys out of position. And a team like the Leafs, they didn't do it in game one, but in game two, they knew that they had to take advantage. And I'll credit the Leafs because what they did this year is they made sure they had the depth to do it. They didn't have the depth last year, really, up front. And on the back end, it was roughly the same, I would say. They just realized that one or two injuries will really impact the way that their way the team is, and Tampa's seeing that right now. Tampa's seeing the crunch of being a Stanley Cup champion. It's not just the fact that the cap has gone to them, but it's also a lot of miles on these guys. A guy like Victor Hedman has played a lot of hockey over the last few years.
Their whole team has.
Yes,
The whole team. They've been to three Stanley Cups, won two, lost one, have gone deep in the playoffs. All these, during the pandemic, they played as many as anybody, I guess. Yeah, no, that's very true. And the other thing that the Leafs have done that's very important, and I'll put my spin on it, and that is they've made the cap less relevant. When you talked about Tampa, the reason they lost their defenseman is because they needed to sign Braden Point. You know, uh, McDonough, Point. it's a no-brainer. But
Yeah.
you know what? It's a win-lose situation. You win by keeping point. You lose by having to release McDonough to another team. Let him go to another team because you just don't have the cap space for him, and that's a challenge every team has. Now, what we do have though in the National Hockey League is we have seen a lot of teams who conveniently have injured players who all of a sudden turn up healthy in game one. We've seen that. And Gary Bettman and company warn teams that they better be careful when they do that. We'll see how that is pursued in the future because we've seen it. We've seen Boston has a player that was out for I think a few months, and ex-Leaf, by the way, who played in game one. That's the way it works. That's just you get to do what you can. And I'm happy for players who are injured making it back in time. Hopefully, it's only because of timing, not plans. That's the concern a lot of people have.
Yeah, no, it's when you look at it doesn't get any easier either, right? Like it doesn't get any easier when the NHL decides to put these rules in place to make sure teams don't it helps those teams obviously with the cap issues.
Mm.
Then you know the NHL says the cap is good for parity for the league, but then the good teams, as we've seen, have found ways around that and to say, you know what, we're good enough that we can sit. The Tampa Bay Lightning sat Nikita Kucherov for an entire year. Okay, for an entire year, made it to. I'll give them credit; they made it to the playoffs without him. But then when the playoffs came around, it's like, oh, guess what? He's bang up, he's healthy, he's ready to go. Like things like that make the NHL it lacks the credibility of what the NHL is trying to do with this salary cap because teams will always find a way around it. Teams always do. Teams get smart once in a while and they know what to do with it.
Perception can be a reality, and that's is essentially the issue. On another issue like that, as far as perception is concerned, the league put a referee in a game to call a game that has a brother-in-law whom the coach of one of the teams testified against. Perception is a problem. Like, it doesn't matter to what I will say is this. I am not accusing the referee of reffing in a negative manner in regards to the Maple Leafs. We can say factually the Leafs have never beaten him since 2017, beaten the team they're playing against since 2017. They're 0-8. We know that to be true. We know in the game that he reffed, a call was made of a cross check that was nowhere anything like a cross check, and it wasn't even corrected. My point is this: perception is reality. And if you're a Leaf fan and you see something like that, it creates, the typical complaints by fans, right? But when you see that play, you could write it off as just an official's mistake. But when you have a referee who has the perception of a motive to be against the team and you put that guy in there and you're the National Hockey League, you're creating an opportunity for a major problem. And I will also say this: to me, it almost sounds like and looks like they don't care if that referee has a grudge with the Leaf coach. That's wrong. They have to care. They have to care to make sure that there's no bias on the ice, perceived or otherwise.
That's the big one there for me. I personally it wouldn't I could think that Wes McCauley definitely he'll try to do his job professionally and things. I can believe that.
He's an entertainer.
But the issue is not addressing it and just putting it off as if it's nothing. And that's the issue there is like the perception is wrong. And as long as the story's out there and as long as the NHL doesn't come out to say anything, fans are going to continue to believe that it's the case, right? They're going to
The
continue
fix is in.
exactly. They're going to continue to say, "Oh, the NHL, oh, they don't care if the Leafs are dealing with something like this. They don't care." Well, I mean, the NHL should care, but the problem is that they haven't been given the benefit. They haven't been given any reason to not believe it. And that's the problem.
Yeah, and it serves not as proof that there's bias, but when there's apparent bias, it's a very strong accelerant. It totally, then they point at that and they go, see, that's why he shouldn't be reffing. And he did that because he doesn't like the coach and yada, yada, yada. Sometimes I think the National Hockey League under Bettman, unfortunately, sometimes they're very stubborn
Yep.
and very stuck on their thinking and aren't very open minded. They're very closed minded at times. And anybody who doubts that, there are a lot of issues that has crossed the National Hockey League that have put them in an embarrassing situation because they did have the blinders on. We've seen, I'm not going to go, we can go chapter and verse. We can do a whole show on the stuff that the shenanigans and terrible things that have happened under the NHL's watch. I don't want to do that. I just want to generally say that the thing is, what has to happen is there has to be basically a mitigation of the possibility that they look like they are, kind of playing favorites. And I've been one of the school that believes Gary Bettman brought to the National Hockey League the NBA thinking where they protect the star players and star teams. The NBA, it's a given fact. It's just, yeah, that's the way it is. But the NBA has worked very hard since Bettman left to change that, to make it not that way. And they've worked very hard to try and create an atmosphere where the officials are responsible for enforcing the rules. Unfortunately, Gary Bettman and the National Hockey League don't do that. They've drifted away from doing things that are right. There's lots of things that I can point out. If I were a Leaf fan, I'm a Toronto fan, not a Leaf fan, but I can go back to the issue of Spezza getting a 7-game suspension for a first offense. You know how many players haven't had a 7-game suspension and some of the things they've done? That is the kind of stuff that gives perception to Leaf fans, and other fans criticize Leaf fans for being upset about something like that. All I can say is every other fan base, name me an innocent, clean player who's had a 7-game suspension on your roster. Just name that player for me. Please, name him for me. You're not going to find them. And that creates the perception, which is reality in some people's eyes, where the league appears to not be very fair to Toronto fans. I'm saying Toronto fans because for me, it's not about the Leafs, it's about the fans. And the league can be very insulting to Leaf fans as opposed to the team.
Well, and that's it, right? I think it's hard to not look at those things. It doesn't get talked about enough, and that's because the media doesn't want to make excuses for this team, and nor they shouldn't be.
It's
That's not
changing, though, David. It is changing. Go ahead, finish your thought. And
It's funny. I'll bring a more real time view of this. Right now, we just had a series tied last night. The LA Kings tied their series against the Oilers, and the coach comes out, and everyone's coming. The media's coming out saying, "Well, they don't know the players don't know what line that they're playing on right now because playoff hockey is supposed to be different, right? We're supposed to be playing under different rules in the playoffs." Whose fault is that for the players' mentality thinking that the rules suddenly change in the playoffs? It's the league's fault because the league decides the rule book changes in the playoffs, right? So teams have to,
they admit it.
yeah. And guess what? Teams admit it when they make moves to say, you know what? We played this way in the regular season. Look at the Leafs the whole time. Skill, 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 skill. Trade deadline. Let's gut a good portion. Let's bring in 5 new guys, all to do this one thing that you need to do in the playoffs, which is play with a little more physicality, aggressive. Now, that's not a bad thing if you want to address that. But the Leafs had to change their mindset, their roster construction, because they realized that, again, especially against Tampa, they needed to change the way they play because the whistles are not exactly coming out consistently or in a way that you think is going to be right. And so, like, the Oilers had this happen last night. The players are complaining about it. Well, guess what? Welcome to what the Leafs were dealing with for the last 5 years. It truly is something that the NHL shouldn't be okay with, they shouldn't be okay with the way that the perception is right now.
Gary Bettman is anti-Canadian teams. He's anti-Canadian teams. It's just that simple. Anybody who doesn't see it is foolish. The Winnipeg Jets were departed from Winnipeg in the middle of the night, and then you have the Phoenix experience, where hell or high water, that team's not moving. In fact, we'll move them into a tiny arena which can't provide decent television. There's shadows. I worked on some cable broadcasts where the lighting was better and the camera appearances were better. So let's be clear about this. I'm a proud Canadian, and I don't like the way the Canadian teams are treated. I have to say that because, quite frankly, in my opinion, it's true. I had a bit of a discussion with a friend of mine the other day, and I said, "Well, how do you feel about favoritism?" And I mentioned the Spezza thing. And here's one for you that I don't know if I've ever mentioned this to you. For 20 years, it was almost 20 years, the Boston Bruins were on WSBK. It's a cable. It was a channel on cable, and every other Canadian team, except for when fits into the formula, you cannot watch a Winnipeg game while a local Leaf game is on. You can't watch a Leaf game while a Winnipeg or whatever area they deem as their territory. In other words, there was no territorial infringement when it came to television, except one team. One team was allowed to be broadcasted into all the cities in Canada, Ontario, Canada, everywhere, was the Boston Bruins. They did not suffer from the rule that the league had. They were given the exception. And it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that the Bruin owner hired Gary Bettman. So again, this is about appearances. Am I saying it was a plan? Am I saying it's 100% true? No. What I'm saying, though, is I'm pointing to simple facts that point to favoritism as a result, not as a plan, because I can't get inside Gary Bettman's head. I cannot get into the owner's head of the Boston Bruins, but I can say that they bent the rules for the Bruins when it came to television in Canada. They bent the rules to give Spezza a 7-game suspension. A 7-game suspension. These are all things that are not. I'm not talking about judgment calls here. I'm talking about simple facts. I'm not saying that Spezza didn't deserve a suspension. I'm just highlighting who he is, his history, and the amount of suspension he got in his first suspension was 7 games. So those kinds of things I defend Toronto hockey fans and Canadian hockey fans, and we're struggling, you and I, because I haven't had a chance to see it yet because I didn't see the game. Edmonton lost the hockey game possibly because of an illegal goal.
Yeah, they're claiming that a high stick should have been called. Problem is, the angles I'm seeing, I can't get a definitive yes or no that the stick touched the puck. Like, the angles are not there to see it. But at this, like, it's crazy to think that I'm not one to believe that it's all Gary Bettman in terms of the Canadian teams not being able to have success. I will say that the way that the league has operated hasn't exactly favored the Canadian markets, because the Canadian markets are the minority while the American markets are the majority. And
But
but you also look at how much the Canadian markets mean to the league. I'll say this. I
But be blunt. Be blunt. The Canadian teams, the Rogers contract that they signed, and they paid the National Hockey League. The 7 Canadian teams have the Canadian teams, the Canadian network that provides Canadian fans with television, compared to the American network that provides television. The Canadian teams, Canada provides 10 times as much money to the National Hockey League per team than the American teams. So my point is, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but what you're saying, that's the part that irritates me, is that Canadian fans pay through the nose for the National Hockey League under Bettman, and except for the Montreal Canadiens, who won the Stanley Cup a couple of months after he was hired, That's the last time that the Canadian team has won in '93. To me, it's follow the money. I believe in follow the money. So all you got to do is follow who's been profiting from the experience of Bettman being in charge, and we know it's teams that are not in hockey hotbeds, and I understand why. It's to increase the business. It's about money, but not about character, morals, and fairness.
Well, I'll say this. You're not totally wrong there. I mean, we've seen the NHL has prioritized certain markets to make sure that they experience success and they get themselves into a position where, like, look at Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay was never a market that people believe could be a success.
Absolutely.
You win a few
Stanley Cups help.
championships and it helps. Yeah. You look at the teams that have been in the cup final the last few years. I look at teams like um, the Lightning. Avalanche had gotten there as a hockey market, obviously, in those early years when they expanded over from when they were relocated from Quebec. So like that's another one there. The LA Kings. That was Gary Bettman's pet project to bring hockey to California, and the Kings were, the team, right? I'm trying to think of some other markets that we can put
Well,
with,
they tried Atlanta, but they couldn't make it work.
and they might try it again. I hear. Um, there's a
Well,
very
again, that has to do with money, and that has to do with a TV hub.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. You have now your
It's why they hang on to Phoenix. Phoenix is like the fourth largest television market.
it is. No, you're not wrong there. And you look back. I'm just checking one thing here quickly, and yeah, you look at the modern day champions, the Avalanche, the Lightning, and who are those teams that were in the finals? The Stars, the one Canadian team that made the finals in the last few years, the Canadians, in a year where really I don't think anybody really thought the Canadians were going to be the Canadian team to reach the Cup final. The St. Louis Blues, the Washington Capitals. I think there's no better example of this than when the
Carolina.
Vegas Golden Knights, in their first year of existence, reached a Stanley Cup final when certain teams haven't been to a cup final in God knows how long.
They create an opportunity for them by
Yep.
allowing them to be the only team to come into the league and
Yep.
offer them a better group of players to pick from alone.
And
Alone.
exactly. And teams not knowing how to do the expansion draft properly. You know, I look at the Predators. That was another market the Tennessee market, they really wanted to get going there. Um, but yeah, I would say, yeah, the fact that there's been a lack of Canadian teams. Well, let's be real here too. The Canadian teams hadn't exactly been world beaters. Like, I look at Chicago when they were reaching the cup final, the Rangers, the Penguins, the Capitals. They had really this. You know what it is that the star talent has been produced by Canada, but they haven't been staying in Canada.
And why? This isn't the National Hockey League's fault. This is unfortunate, but Canadian hockey players, two things they want: to win the cup and earn the most money they can. For certain players, that's what they want to do. For the players that want to do that, they can't play in Canada. You're not going to win a cup in Canada, and you're not going to get the same kind of tax breaks and earn as much money if you play as if you play in the United States. For the longest time over the past 20 years, the captains of the Canadian teams were Swedes. They weren't Canadians. They were Americans. They weren't Canadians.
Yep.
What does that tell you? What does it tell you? But I will say this, that a lot of Canadian teams have had struggles. Winnipeg has had struggles where they've had a difficult time trying to hang on to players because players don't want to play in Winnipeg. That's the challenge the Canadian teams have as much as anything else, and that is attracting really good players to stay and to be in their market. It's hard. It's hard for Montreal. It's hard for Vancouver. it's less difficult for Toronto because Toronto has the one advantage no Canadian team has other than them, and that is being the richest Canadian team, along with the Canadians, definitely. But English speaking Toronto is more of a home for players from around the world. They're all willing to play in Toronto. Montreal has a lot of class, a lot of standards. They are an organization that rich in history and all that stuff, but it's hard to get players to play in Canada. It's difficult.
Uh, my last point on this is look at what the Calgary Flames, what happened to them.
Exactly.
Had two of their best players, their top point producers, decide, I don't want to be here anymore. Trade me. One of them decided, you know what? Maybe I'll come back. Then in the last moment, he's like, you know what? I'm going to Columbus. He Johnny Gaudreau decided that the Columbus Blue Jackets were going to be a better team for him to go to than the Calgary Flames. The Columbus Blue Jackets were one of the worst teams in the NHL, and they said it was to be closer to home, to his family. Ohio's not New Jersey. It's not close to New Jersey, really that close to New Jersey.
No.
And then Matthew Tkachuk, he decides, I want to leave, and he goes to Florida, the Florida Panthers. Everyone thought, oh, he's going to want to go home to his where he was born. He wants to go to St. Louis, to Missouri because he's from there. Maybe even Boston because he's got roots in Boston. Nope, the Florida Panthers. Gee, I wonder
Sunshine.
what about, I mean, Sun. Yeah, he could have picked many teams for Sunshine.
Absolutely.
What's the one
Well,
thing?
he went to Florida because Florida wanted him really. They really wanted him a lot, and they have kind of a physical team,
Yeah,
and I think he fit their mold, and I think he felt they fit his mold.
but here,
They agreed. I think that was an agreement between the two. They'd be good for each other.
but what's one thing that Florida doesn't have that a lot of other teams have? The ability to market yourself as a star and get those marketing dollars that a lot of these players covet because your NHL contract, he's being paid. That's not the issue, but there's opportunity to make even more money. And he
And therein lies why I say Toronto has an advantage that the other Canadian teams don't have, and that's why I said about English, because in the English community, Toronto, if you're playing for Toronto, there's a lot of business opportunities that you have. I'm not sneezing at what you can get in Montreal, but it's different.
and how many players on the Leafs have come to Toronto? I'm especially Russian players play in Toronto, decide, you know what, I'm going to see what's out there, and they're one of the more coveted players. Look at Ilya Mikheyev when he was with Toronto. I didn't think the guy would have been worth more than $3 million at most. And he got well over that by the Vancouver Canucks. Another
Yep.
team, but Ilya Lubushkin, a defenseman that maybe I would have signed for $2 million, he got an extra $75,000 to go play for Buffalo in 3 years. You know, there is something to be said that the Canadian markets, while the tax situation's not beneficial, the Canadian winters, although you're playing during the Canadian winter time, so the weather should be a factor. Like it's one thing I will say about the weather in Canada: these players are playing when the weather is really bad.
They're working.
They're working, and guess what most of them do during their off season? They have a separate house and they go and they live there in the summertime. I look at McDavid has a place in Arizona. Matthews, obviously from Arizona, goes back to Arizona. Mark Scheifele, who is from Canada, has a place in California. I can name a list of many of these players. They understand, and some of them have cottages in Ontario as well. But they have enough money where they can say, you know what, for part of the year, I'm gonna go live somewhere hot because when I'm playing, it doesn't matter what the weather's like. They like the market. They like what the teams have to offer. Unfortunately, that hasn't been enough in some cases for these Canadian teams.
Another reason that Toronto is attractive more than other Canadian teams is that they have a good team, and they're willing to bring in players on a basically on a sniff test, right? I give you examples of the goalie that left Toronto to go to Edmonton. Look at the goalie they have now in Samsonov. He's playing on a team that can help make him look good. He can write his own ticket. He's as good as gold. He's going to get a job somewhere, and I doubt it'll be in Toronto. I really do. I doubt he'll stay in Toronto. I don't think Toronto will be able to compete with what he's going to earn because of him playing here in Toronto on a good team and getting all that attention we talk about that certain teams offer, players. So, there's a good opportunity for players when they come to Toronto because they've got a good organization. They're competitive. They play great in the regular season. The hope is the playoffs. But the most important thing that Toronto has to offer, and that is the local players that come back here to play, starting with Spezza. They tapped a little bit into that, and we're seeing a lot of benefit in regards to that. And that kind of stuff with G on defense, he's playing in Toronto for a lot less he could play for somewhere else, but he's playing at home. And those are cap busters. Those kinds of players are cap busters. If they can have a few of those, that's an advantage that they have above anybody else because they have a good team and because of where they're located. So there are a lot of advantages that Canadian teams can figure out. It's just hard in the North American market when you're doing what you said, and I agree with you 100%. If you're a player that's looking to market himself, it's hard to do in Winnipeg. It's hard to do it North America wide. So yeah, so you end up somewhere else. I mean, the kind of money that Matthews is making outside of his contract is pretty good. And it's pretty much because he's a Maple Leaf that he's doing that, as is Marner, as is even the captain now, with gambling and stuff. The advertising dollars that they can acquire playing in Toronto is an advantage that creates a bit of animosity towards the organization, the team, and their fans. It's one of the reasons why I maintain that a lot of fans outside Toronto don't like the Leafs and make excuses for hating them is because, quite frankly, the Leafs have advantages that other teams don't in Canada.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, and it's not going to change. I look at the NBA, right, and how it's brought up about Canada being cold, the tax situation, all of those things. People say, "Oh, why can't the Raptors get free agents?" And it's like because these players, unfortunately, are not educated to understand what Toronto can offer them, and that's the unfortunate thing.
Yeah, it's place unknown, and of course it doesn't help that the NBA as a league had an opportunity to discriminate against two Canadian teams, Vancouver and Toronto, because the rest were American. They could agree on something, and what they agreed on was that after they gave the franchises to Toronto and Vancouver, they said for 5 years you cannot win the lottery.
Yeah,
Never done before. All of a sudden, when two Canadian teams join, you create that stipulation. My point is that we in Canada here are our little brother, and sometimes we're bullied by Americans. That's just the way it is. So when we talk, if I can go back to the Maple Leafs and what's going on with them, as justified as Maple Leaf fans are in their mind, whether it's factual, perception, or just in their minds, the fact is, the Leaf team has to rise above anything that looks suspicious. They cannot get carried away. I cite the example. I cite the example of the elbow that caused a 3-game suspension. That's basically losing your temper and doing something you shouldn't do. I will never justify that. It's not justifiable. But the Leafs have to do the opposite. They have to work hard, and they did it in the second game. The penalties weren't going their way early, David. They overcame, um, you know, possible devastation, another 3-0 lead for Tampa. But they turned it around by great penalty killing and great power play and commitment to the game, not to the BS, not to the circus, which Tampa brings to the game. You know, we saw even in Hockey Night in Canada, they mentioned, well, look, the Leafs are winning, and now all of a sudden there's fights everywhere. That didn't happen when the Leafs were losing 7-3. That's the point. So the Leafs have to remember that Tampa is going to do whatever they can to to basically get them off their game. And the Leafs didn't get off their game in the last one, and that's what they're going to have to do in the next one, the first one in Tampa.
Yeah, no, and that's gonna be crucial. It's going to be crucial in the series, right? You have to take advantage of opportunities, right? And that's something the Leafs haven't been able to do. Like, if you look back at every single series that the Leafs have played recently, there's always that chance for them to gain an advantage and finish things off. I look back to the last time they played Boston, they lose game 6 and then game 7, back to back.
4-1 lead.
4-1 lead, right? The Leafs had opportunities where they're up 3-2 in a series, have a chance to close it out, and then they lose game 6 and 7. They did it last year. Against Tampa, they have a big win, and then they followed up with a loss. They have, and I understand in the playoffs it's hard to gain momentum from game after game, but what shouldn't be hard is understanding that when you play so well and you dominate and you show the other team that we're better than you, you got to carry that to the next game because you're supposed to be the better team. Like tonight for game 3, the Leafs mentality should be we beat this team without needing to get a bunch of power plays. Like they
Survived the first 10 minutes.
Yes, that is the biggest. That is the biggest battle. Surviving the first 10 minutes and winning the battle up here, up in your head, right? Because if the what the Tampa Bay Lightning are going to try to do, and my friend said this, and I totally agree with him, they're going to try to throw the Leafs off their game.
That's what they do. That's their game plan.
Like, why were the Leafs taking undisciplined penalties in game 1? Because they were getting frustrated, and Tampa was that frustration. They were being baited, and they're saying, well, and I think Tavares said it, which was, we're not going to get the benefits of the call because we're not the reigning Stanley Cup champions or we haven't been to the finals. So we have to be careful with what we do because they're not going to give us anything easy. And guess what? He was totally right. So what did you do in game 2? You let Tampa get undisciplined. And I use the word unhinged. Tampa was I was at that game. Third period, Tampa was trying to do things in that third period that they were doing in the first period. The refs started to call it. The refs let it go in the first period. Like Patrick Maroon hit Justin Hall behind the play, didn't have the puck, hit him into the boards. We're all going, that's not a penalty. In the third period, he does the same exact thing, and he gets a penalty for it. The refs this is where the refs have a say in how the game goes because in that third period, the Tampa Bay Lightning are down by a lot. The refs know that Tampa's going to try to do things outside of the whistles, and when the whistles are blown, and they're not going to have it, so they started to tighten things up. So what the Leafs are going to have to do in those first 10 minutes is Tampa's going to come out and they're going to try to throw you off your game. They're going to be aggressive. The Leafs have to, not give up anything to them, make Tampa work for their chances, and B,
earn their chances.
Yeah.
No free rides anymore. Nope. Tampa has lived on some free rides.
And the biggest change that we saw from game 2 to game 1, the big boys played a lot more in that start of the game. Sheldon Keefe got too cute trying to match up lines, trying to get his physical players out there. No, get your best players out there. Your best players.
That's not the only thing that he did. When he moved O'Reilly to the third line center position, their fortunes changed. The experiment of having the captain on left wing, I think, is over.
I think John Tavares showed you that he is still a pretty good center in the NHL.
Absolutely. I think a hat trick says that. Yeah, I think.
I don't think he needs Ryan O'Reilly to hold his hand. I understood why Sheldon Keefe wanted to try it, but no. When you get a Ryan O'Reilly and you're able to go 3 centers deep. Remember, did you hear what John Cooper said after the game 2? They asked, did you feel like it was a bit tougher? I'm going to paraphrase. It wasn't exactly the question, but is it a challenge when the Leafs go with three centers deep with Tavares, Matthews, and O'Reilly, and he says, "And we don't have good centers." Like that was his response. We don't have good centers. I'll take point. I'll take Point, Paul, and Sorelli over anybody in the league. So what does he do? So what does Cooper now have? He's going to tell his players. They think now because they put O'Reilly on the third line center that they can beat anybody in the league, and he's going to use that bulletin board.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. He says things for cause and effect. Everything he says is for cause and effect, and he does it very well, and good for him. And I hope when and if he's the coach of the Canadian team, he brings his best talents to the team. Again, waving my Canadian flag. I don't apologize. There's something to be said for O'Reilly being the third line center. Great move. I think it's important that you know depth depth down the middle is very important. We talked earlier about Riley doing what he does, and what we skirted around is that the Leaf Big Four contributed, and that's what's important too. The four highest paid players on the Toronto Maple Leafs and the highest paid defenseman were all there on the score sheet doing what they need to do, and that is put distance between them and the opposition by scoring goals and not out shooting the opposition 44-20 and losing 3-2. That's something that they have done too often in this season. They can't afford to do that. But to your point, the most important thing that the Leafs can do for their coach, their team, and their fans is be disciplined, committed to the work and the plan.
Yeah, no, exactly. The Leafs have to. There has to be a commitment and a buy-in from the whole team. There has to be. Um, from top to bottom, the stars have to be the ones to lead the charge.
Yeah, it's an old saying. The singers have to sing, the dancers have to dance. It's just the way it is. It has to be that way, and it's going to be a really great game tonight. The physicality won't kick in, I don't think, right away, or it might. There might be an establishment of that. It depends how rambunctious the Tampa team is at home to, exacerbate the difficulty the Leafs will have playing on the road. In other words, they're going to want to get the fans behind them. So there's probably going to be a lot of early contact by Tampa to help get that bandwagon full of cheering fans. And the Leafs are going to have to overcome that, as we said, as we both agreed in the first 10 minutes of the game.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to have to weather the storm.
It's going to be a really interesting game, and I got to tell you, I'm looking forward to watching it, and kind of hoping that the game is as good as I think it can be. Not that if you're a Leaf fan or a Toronto fan like I am, you don't want to see a secure victory. Do away with the excitement of a close game. But regardless, if it's a good game, that's all we can hope for as hockey fans. I think we can all agree with that.
Exactly. Yeah. That's all you can hope for. And if you're a Leafs fan, you just have to hope that the best players come out and be the best players, because the best players on the Leafs, I know Tampa's got really good players, but the best players on the Leafs can match and even beat the players on Tampa. You can believe that. Don't worry. You can have faith in that, because it's been proven that the Leafs do have a good team.
If the Leafs have a successful run, I'm not predicting that they will. One of the reasons why the Raptors won the championship, if everyone remembers, there were key injuries to the opposition through the whole trip. In every series, the Raptors caught a break with injuries to opponents. We're seeing that in Tampa. So getting by Tampa with a little help from the hockey gods, is necessary. Every championship is built on stuff over and above what a team can do.
Well, it is. I mean, I don't think the Toronto Raptors have the success they do you know, if at the time Kevin Durant wasn't 100% healthy for the Golden State Warriors,
Absolutely.
right? That's the thing in the NBA. The star talent is really hard to beat the star talent in the NBA,
You
unfortunately.
only got 5 guys on the floor, and they play for not just a minute and a half.
Yes.
They're out there for a while.
No, you're totally right about that.
So yeah, you're right. Very impactful. Well, listen, thank you for sitting in for Aaron. It was my pleasure to have you on here. I really am grateful for you taking the time with us.
No problem. I appreciate it.
Okay, he's David Morisuti. I'm Candid Frank Stanisci. Thank you for watching Candid Frank Live's Leaf Talk. Special day and special time, usually at 6 p.m. on Fridays, seen live. And I hope you enjoyed it. I know we did. You can also check us out on Spanglish World Radio, the network, for Leaf Talk, other news, entertainment, and sports programming we offer. Please check out SpanglishWorld.ca. Spanglish World. Watch it, hear it, read it, download it, live it. And also, you can watch the Candid Frank Stanisci 1030 YouTube channels. Please subscribe. Join me. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you again next week.
Okay.